Remaining open to joy. I want to start by telling you a story about my daughter, Christiana. A couple of stories. For those of you who don't know, my daughter, Christiana, who's now 29, suffered from viral encephalitis when she was 13 months old. And so at that time, everything that was developing in her little brain was disrupted or destroyed or disturbed or something. And so it's been a long, 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 long road for her to find her way back and for her brain to function again and develop somewhat normally. So just so you have that background, I wanted to give you two stories of what happened when she was little. So the first one is when she was somewhere around the age of 3 or 4. She wasn't very verbal at all yet. We at that time thought she was autistic, and because she had a lot of the characteristics of many autistic children at that age. One of the thing was echolalia. She would repeat often phrases that she'd hear around her over and over again. And when she saw little Barney episodes, she'd repeat them over and over again, and she'd want them repeated for her on the videotape over and over again. So we realized that she wasn't picking up social cues, even if she went to a child care a couple times a week, on just learning how to play. So for a while, every night after dinner, I'd go up to her room and I decided we'd learn to play Barbies. So we went and found some used a Barbie doll and a Ken doll and a house and, that kind of stuff, pretty cheap somewhere. And the first time I sat down and played with her, I mirrored things that we did in our house. Like people came home from work and they made dinner together and sat down and had dinner and maybe did something afterwards. And then they kind of went to bed and got up, that kind of stuff, real simple. Well, every time I'd sit down with her and we'd go play Barbies, it would be the same thing over and over and over again, the same story, repetitive. She'd remember every single tiny detail. And this happened hundreds of times, probably. And then one day, I wasn't kind of paying attention because I heard it so many times, but suddenly Ken went out to check the mail, because one of us does go out to check the mail from time to time. And I thought, oh my God, something just changed. It was just this joyful moment where I realized that she wasn't stuck in a repetitive loop, that there was part of her brain that was developing, trying to do creative thought and express itself. And that was a minor difference. And it was the first time we'd ever seen something like that. And so it was just this so joyful, happy moment for us to see that she was developing and that there was the capacity for her to become more. It was wonderful. Well, then about 6 years later, she was 9 or 10. I want to tell you the Pokemon card story. So at that time, Pokemon cards had come out, and she saw her younger brother, who was actually more mature than her at the time. So she looked up to him as an older brother. Her younger brother had really gotten into Pokemon cards. He told me that they came out when he was in kindergarten. And from that point until about 10 years old, he was very involved in it. And so were all of his friends. And so he would do all the things like go to this game shop and buy the Pokemon decks after he saved up his allowance. And then he'd put the cards in his binder and he'd sit with his friends and they'd compare cards in their collections and what the powers did. And then they'd trade them and that kind of thing. Well, one day I was out front, probably gardening or something like that. And I noticed that he and his friends, who were all boys, were sitting across the street in the lawn with their Pokemon books doing exactly that. And while I was sitting there working, Christiana came out of the house and she had the same kind of thing, a big binder under her arm. Now I knew that she had become interested in it and talked to her brother about it. And I think he gave her cards that were duplicates and that kind of thing. But she came out of the house with this binder under her arm and she walked across the street and sat down in the middle of the boys. She still really struggled with social skills, didn't announce herself or anything, just sat down. And as expected, within 30 seconds, a minute or so, they all got up and went to one of the boys' homes and left her there, which just like stabbed a dagger in my heart. And I was just feeling so sad. And just kind of, it threw me into a spiritual crisis there, because I just, from that point on, realized that I'd lost control. When we were playing Barbies in her room, it was just me and her and maybe one of her tutors or something like that. And so it was very controlled. And so the moments were just amongst us, and it was a very supportive environment. But now she was trying to go like her brother out into the world and participate the way she saw her brother do it. And we all knew that she was not going to be able to do it the way her brother did it. And that just was really hard to take and see. So over time, her mom and I would often try to talk her out of things. If she was going to like bring it up, or sometimes she wouldn't even tell us, we got a sense that she was going to go do something, and we try to talk her out of it, or redirect her or something. And over time, she viewed that as us not willing to let her grow up, not letting her be who she wanted to become. And all we were trying to do is shield her from disappointment, from the pain, and maybe in years later, even from other people who are just going to be downright mean to her. So our reluctance to let her, to go along with her, eventually fueled a lot of anger, belligerence, and ultimately violence from her when she got to be a teenager. And this pattern just continued on for years. We had the best of intentions, but the result was it pretty much sucked the joy out of our lives most of the time. Well, I brought you that story because it's a topic that Brene Brown talks about in her book. Now, I have to say, I tripped across it this month. It was not my intention at first. The quote that I read was from our Soul Matters packet this month, and the theme is opening to joy. Now, it listed the quote, and then it listed her name, but it didn't say where it came from. So I did a little research, and it came from her big book, big seller, The Gift of Imperfection. And it just turns out that in 2020, it was the 10th anniversary of her first publishing the book. And at that time, I realized I had actually never read the book. I had seen her TED Talk when she talks about the concepts in the book. She wrote subsequent books, which I did read, but I realized I never actually read the original book. So if you haven't read it, I highly recommend it. And she's added sort of this user's guide to the 10th anniversary edition. So she wants to make it as useful as possible to people. And if you've never heard of Brene Brown, she's a social researcher at the University of Houston. And she and her staff does thousands and thousands of interviews to try to understand how humans work, particularly on really complicated topics like shame and imperfection. Now, she packs a lot of concepts into her writing. I have to reread passages over and over again because she has really powerful concepts, but she uses great stories and a lot of self-effacing humor. So even though it's really dense, it's also very approachable. So in this particular book, what I found, and it's one of her practical parts of her book, it's called Guidepost 4, Cultivating Gratitude and Joy, Letting Go of Scarcity and Fear of the Dark. Now, in all of her research, she said she found 3 primary patterns from her research on gratitude and joy. And first of all, she notes that she never thought about gratitude and joy going together, but she said every single person who described themselves as joyful regularly practiced gratitude, that they very much went together. So that was the first pattern she saw. The second one was that people who experience joy, or say that they're basically joyful, had strong belief in human interconnectedness and in a power greater than themselves. Now, they didn't say a specific power, but that there was something greater than themselves, and they very much believed in human interconnectedness. And the third thing was a distinction between happiness and joy, which frankly I'd never thought of before. So she says happiness is circumstantial. It's not within your control. It just happens to you. There's a quote, happiness is, quote, an atmosphere you can live in if you're lucky, that all the right things just happen to you. Whereas joy is a spiritual connection, an attitude that pervades everything and is grounded in a behavior of gratitude. She says, joy is a light that fills you with faith, hope, and love. So last year, for those of you that were around during the middle of the pandemic when everything was being done from my home office, last year I did a sermon titled 50 Shades of Gratitude as a way to kind of help us get through the depths of the pandemic. It was a long winter. And I asked us to find something that we were grateful for 50 days, from Thanksgiving to mid-January, and to tell somebody about it, write it down, post it, just make sure that you're being held accountable for doing this and that you get to talk about it with people. And a lot of people did. I heard feedback that they'd had conversations with family members or housemates, or I saw a lot of people posting on Facebook. Well, it was very well intentioned and we had a great response as a spiritual practice. But this year, I'm focused more on Brown's research into what gets in the way of being open to joy. So what gets in the way? Well, Brown basically says two things, scarcity and fear. In scarcity, she talks about the twinkle-like quote, the joy comes in small, ordinary moments. And she talks about how the fact that joy isn't a floodlight, that'd be unbearable. Well, she says many times we're too busy chasing down those extraordinary moments or what we anticipate to be the most joyful thing in my life. Like you're planning that big trip to Disneyland, or it's somebody's wedding, or a special birthday party where you invited everyone and all the food was absolutely perfect. We're so wrapped up in those, looking for those extraordinary moments that we miss the small twinkly lights. Or another one is, she would say in the scarcity, it's the not enough syndrome. That you'll say, you know what, I just didn't get sleep last night. I haven't had enough coffee. I'm not smart enough. I never have enough money. Look at me, I've got 20 pounds on me that I don't like. I'm not getting enough exercise. I'm not fit enough. It's endless. Basically, it's if I only were fill in the blank, then I could experience joy. Well, she goes on to describe that the recipients, or the people she'd interviewed rather, who had gone through terrible loss, where they'd lost someone close to them, a parent, a child, maybe a pet, that they talked about the joy in their lives came from the smallest things, the things that they missed, like the sound of the screen door slamming every time a kid goes in and out. Or maybe siblings kind of fighting over the rules of a game in the back room of the house. Or joy was simply taking the time to watch the sunset with a beloved pet in your lap. So that's scarcity. Fear. She says, we are so afraid of the dark, we don't even enjoy the light. We are afraid that joy will make us vulnerable. We realize that we can't control everything, that joy just pops up once in a while. We didn't make it happen. And then there's this whole thing of foreboding joy, which I think is sort of an upper Midwest cultural thing, that maybe it's everywhere. When I lived in Minnesota, you don't know how many times I'd hear people say, oh my God, look at the day. It's 70 degrees in January. Can you believe it? But oh my God, don't get into it too much, because a doozy of a storm is probably going to happen. We're going to pay for this. You never could just appreciate the warm weather for what it was. So back to Christiana's examples, and what does that have to do with fear and scarcity? Well, to me, it had to do with fear. The first example, playing Barbies. It was that time in life, Christiana was still 3 to 4 years old. I still had hope that she would completely recover from her illness, that it just was going to take a lot of time for her brain to heal and for her development to catch up, but things would be okay. She would be able to fit in society and make her own way as easily or as hard as anybody else, right? And so I was still living from a very joyful spirit. and was looking for those small twinkling lights of ordinary joys. But like I said, the fact that Ken went out to get the mail and we could jump for joy in her bedroom was very self-contained, very protected. It was just her parents and the supporting tutors that were there. Whereas the Pokemon cards, that was 6 years later. My attitude had changed and it wasn't very joyful, I admit it. I was still processing grief, intense grief, over the reality that Christiana would always struggle in life just to get by. And as she grew up, like any parent, I lost more and more and more control, which is normal. But in my mind, the stakes were so much higher. And so it was so anxiety producing for me. I mean, my son and his friends acted normally, but like I said, that act of them just getting up and moving to somebody's house just stabbed me in the heart. And I really, really wanted to protect her from that as much as I could. So what that did, there were joyful moments in there, and I just didn't recognize them, right? She took clues from her brother. The fact that she was watching another child and taking cues from them is very, very normal developmental behavior. But I kind of dismissed that. The fact that she figured out what a Pokemon card was, that collecting them were important, and that she connected such an activity as what you do with other people, and she desperately wanted connection. And she did it all on her own. So just that alone should have been a major joy in my life. I should have been celebrating her development, but instead I smothered that little twinkle light with fear, anxiety, and darkness. So that's my story. Let's turn it to you. And by the way, these are the questions that I'm going to have during the discussion time. So where is your spirit now? How's it going at remaining open to joy, the title of the sermon? Or maybe like me, you were in a period in which you wouldn't even say you're open to joy at all. Are you too busy looking for that big happiness floodlight moment to be grateful for the small, ordinary twinkling light moments? Are you afraid to be joyful and you smother the light with darkness? Are you feeling too vulnerable? You don't want to be disappointed again? Well, the solution, according to Brown, we've come full circle. Brown's research shows that a firm belief in the interconnectedness of humanity and gratitude practice are the best ways to be open to joy. In fact, Brown provides examples when she becomes anxious that something's not going to work out, or something could possibly go wrong that's tragic, like a traffic accident or something. She stops herself. She recognizes the behavior in herself, and she focuses on gratitude. And she said, sometimes I have to fake it till I make it. Like I'll pull over the car and I'll sit there and go, I'm grateful for Steve, her husband. I'm grateful for Steve. I'm grateful for Steve. Something that she reminds herself, her family, her home, her job, something that she's very, very grateful for, until she can bring herself back into a better state of mind. So practicing gratitude is firmly interconnected to joy, but you gotta practice it. It's not just thinking about it. And she brings this out and she says, it doesn't really matter how you do this. Some people are much more disciplined. They do journaling every day, or they have a formal practice of meditating where they can bring up gratitude. Last year, I asked you for 50 days to come up with something, and even I had trouble. Frankly, after January 6th, I had trouble sometimes. I forgot about it. I was a little distracted. But I realize if you find automatic ways to trigger gratitude, it helps. For example, you eat 3 times a day. There's a reason my parents and my grandparents and grandparents before them prayed and gave thanks for the food they were about to eat. It was at least one time in the day where they stopped to express gratitude. How about brushing your teeth? You're looking at the mirror anyway. You might as well look yourself in the eye and remind yourself what you're grateful for. Or cleaning something. I've mentioned it before. I love to do dishes because I find it as a spiritual meditative practice. And it automatically reminds me to think about what I'm grateful for. or something we all have access to, sunrises and sunsets, or feeding the cat or a pet. Anyway, you get the point. Something that's repetitive that you do often that triggers letting you have a great gratitude practice. Or probably the one we should all be talking about, practice gratitude by connecting with our fellowships. Last week, I did a presentation in Green Bay to an outside audience. And in the question and answer period, one woman raised her hand and said, is Unitarian Universalism actually really a religion? Because you don't believe in God, so I think it's just a club. And I corrected her and I said, well, some people do believe in God, some people don't. That's not the point of our faith. And by the way, there are other world religions that don't have a deity at the center of them as well. But I said, we do actually believe in something greater than ourselves. And it's the interconnectedness of humanity. The loving and supportive community of our fellowships is what we lift up every Sunday. So connect often, even in these weird times where you might have to do it in a hybrid way, but connect often. And every time you connect, practice gratitude by letting others know how grateful you are for them. So I'm going to close by referring back to part of the quote I read from Brene Brown. I believe a joyful life is made up of joyful moments, gracefully strung together by trust, gratitude, inspiration, and faith. And I believe that is exactly the environment we try to create and support in our fellowships. May it always be so. Amen.